Hello, welcome to AP Macroeconomics. I'm Mr. Sanabria, and today we're going to start our conversation on gross domestic product, which is GDP. It's a price tag on the economy. Well, what we're going to talk about today is exactly what that means to us. We're going to talk about some of the different GDP measures that exist. What I'm specifically talking about there is real GDP versus nominal GDP versus GDP per capita. We're going to actually talk about where this number comes from. What exactly is the equation for calculating GDP? And don't get scared, because that's actually a very easy equation. It's something we're going to work a lot with. You'll know it backwards and forwards. First off, let's go ahead and give ourselves a definition. And I'm actually going to spend a little time on this. I'm going to break this definition down into really its 4 parts. Okay, there's 4 things, there I am, that you really need to remember when you're thinking about what GDP is. And as you can see here, I say it's the market value of final goods and services produced within a nation in a year. And that's absolutely true. This definition is a complete definition for GDP. But it's only complete because it includes the following 4 things. So the first thing that is important when you are thinking of the definition of what GDP is this statement here, market value. Now, notice we're just saying GDP right now. I'm not saying real GDP. And I'm not saying real GDP per capita, and I'm not saying GDP per capita. All I'm saying is GDP. If all you hear is GDP, and often you do, what actually is being talked about is what's called nominal GDP. Okay? And this distinction between nominal GDP and real GDP has everything to do with something else we've talked a little bit about already, which is inflation. So what this inflation means to us is that if I build a truck that's worth $10,000 this year, and then I build the same truck next year, but inflation of, let's say, 10% has occurred, then I would have built a truck that's worth $11,000, right? So the value of the truck year 1, $10,000. Value of the truck year 2 is $11,000. But is the truck fundamentally or really more valuable in the second year? No, it's the same exact truck. It has the same utility, as an economist would say. So we could say that the real value of the truck hasn't changed, right? But the nominal value in name, right, the price tag, literally, has gone up. So the nominal value has increased. So let's walk through this again and think of it in terms of GDP. If this is an economy that produces only one truck, this is an extremely simple economy. An economy that produces one truck, and in 2015, they can sell that truck for $10,000. Next year, they don't experience any growth at all. They still produce one truck. But in that next year, they experienced inflation of 10%, then the GDP is $11,000. So the GDP actually went up. GDP went up. Nominal GDP, that is. But did the real GDP go up? No. So we're defining GDP right now as the market value. And the big takeaway here is that nominal GDP is not necessarily that useful for us because it captures that inflation and potentially misrepresents growth. So what ends up being important to us is real GDP. The real GDP, in my example we just went over, from 2015 to 2016, is $10,000. $10,000, the next year the truck was worth $11,000 as far as a price tag, but we know that 10% of that was only because of inflation. They really produced the same amount, $10,000 worth of stuff. So that's market value, and we'll talk a lot more about that. I know that can get a little complicated. The next part that's absolutely critical for us to understand that we're talking about when we talk about GDP is the little term in there, final goods and services. Final goods and services are those services that are meant for final human consumption. That's a great textbook answer there. So what does that mean? What we think of as final goods and services, those things that actually do count as GDP, are things that are finished. You go out and you buy them because that's the thing you want. Cheeseburgers, or cars, or new house that was finished. Final goods and services. Okay? So GDP so far is the market value, the current year price tag of all of the finished stuff, final goods and services, produced within a nation. This is the third part that you have to understand. Within a nation. And when I say within a nation, I'm talking about the geographical boundary. So if we're speaking about United States GDP, talking about the actual 50 states and territories of the United States of America. So something has to be physically completed in the United States. So some people may be surprised to hear that. Let's think about a company like Nike, who produces a lot of their products in Taiwan and Indonesia. Well, those aren't the United States, right? Those shoes or shirts or whatever other apparel that Nike produces, if they're finished outside of the United States, actually don't count towards U.S. GDP, even though Nike is a U.S. company. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So this is something that does tend to surprise people. You think, okay, well, Nike, that's a U.S. company, whatever, their production counts towards U.S. GDP. Not so. Their production, if and when it occurs within the United States, does count towards U.S. GDP. And conversely, a foreign-owned company that completes products in the United States does count towards U.S. GDP. So let's look at the example of Toyota, a Japanese company who completes Toyota vehicles in San Antonio, Texas. Well, you're looking at a situation where those trucks count towards U.S. GDP. Okay? So we're almost done here. The last part of our four-part definition is in a year. We just need a time frame here, and the time frame we're talking about is a year. Okay? So we measure GDP by year, and really we measure it throughout the year using the quarter system that we talked about with the business cycle. Okay? And I think I've got a slide coming up that's going to illustrate the quarter system a little more. So GDP is the market value, current year prices, right, of all final goods and services produced within a nation in a single year. Okay? And you end up with basically just a big number. It's a price tag. It's a price tag for all of this stuff. Let's move on. We think of GDP, or we use GDP as the aggregate measure of the economy. And I want to take a moment to explain the word aggregate to you, just in case you don't know it already. Aggregate is a word that means including everything. Okay? It's often used in the sense of, I'll use it in a sentence for you, okay? So if I were to say, what would be the effect of a single snowflake that fell on the street? What effect would that single snowflake have on traffic? And you would say, probably not anything at all. Well, here in Austin, maybe it shuts down the whole city. I don't know. But you say, all right, one snowflake, no effect. Well, what would be the aggregate effect of all of the snowflakes that fell during a blizzard? Well, that would shut down the city. You see that? The aggregate effect of all the snowflakes. So GDP, being the aggregate measure of the economy, is saying if we consider all of the economy, how big is it? Okay? This is our aggregate measure of the economy. What I've got here is a cartogram map that, nothing really to note here. I just wanted you to kind of get a little perspective on some of the world GDPs. And this isn't the best map, but I couldn't find one that just isolated individual countries. So what I have here are continents. Okay, so you have the continent of North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. And you can see here that the world GDP is dominated by North America, Europe, and Asia. At this point, it would be a lot better to take China and Japan and even India and hold them separately so you could get some relative size there, and you'd see that China is enormous. The purpose of this really is to show you just a little bit of perspective on the world. So all I'm showing you here is that the United States GDP is enormous. And the things that happen in the United States do affect the global economy in very real ways. That's not just some sort of patriotic, yeah, where America sort of talk, that's realistically what happens in the world. And equally true is what happens in the European Union, because economically speaking, the EU is treated as a single unit. And Japan, if we were able to isolate it here, you'd see that their influence is incredibly strong throughout the world economically, and the things that happen in Japan have a huge impact on global economies. So this is a very real thing, as measured by GDP, which we just discussed is the aggregate measure of the economy. So there's this thing called GNP. And GNP stands for Gross National Product. Okay, GNP is Gross National Product, and this is something that's similar to GDP but different, and easily explained. So remember how with GDP, I hope you remember, it was about a minute ago, I said it has to be stuff that was produced within a nation, right? Geographically speaking, the stuff was finished in the United States or its territories. Well, GNP is a different measure that would measure the value of all the stuff that was completed by U.S. companies. So, and no matter where they were in the world. That example about Nike, if they finished their clothing in Taiwan, well, that would count towards U.S. GNP because Nike's a U.S.-owned company. So it's a different measure, all right? Until the 90s, gross national product was actually what we used as our aggregate measure of the economy. And then we switched to GDP. And, my biggest belief on this reason for this switch is that if you're using GDP, as we will be, as kind of our measuring stick of the economy, and has a lot of utility as far as measuring the health of the economy, right? Is the economy growing or shrinking? Is it getting more healthy, less healthy? It becomes less and less relevant if it's a U.S.-owned company, because so much stuff is produced outside of nations' borders. And that's not just the United States. This happens all over the world. So what is less relevant is who owns the company, or really what legal system the company ownership works under. And what's more important as a measuring stick for health and growth and jobs is where the products are actually being made. And so this switch is made from gross national product to gross domestic product. So if gross national product isn't relevant anymore, well, why am I bringing it up to you? Well, one, to be well-rounded economic thinker, you should just know what GNP is. But also, this is a relatively recent switch. And it may be the case that you're reading a text or you are watching a video, and someone's referring to gross national product, or GNP, and I want you to understand what they mean there. It's a slight difference, but it is pretty key. Okay, and I have given you the measure, or the definition here of GNP. The measure of the value of all goods and services produced by U.S.-owned firms, whether domestically produced or manufactured abroad. So basically the same definition as GDP, but not restricted to the geographical borders of the country. All right, so we've got here the quarter system. And all this is I guess maybe a little more visually representative of what we talked about last time in terms of a quarter of a year being 3 months out of the year. And that's actually when the official GDP numbers come out. Big thing to remember here is, what's a recession? Well, it's defined as 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline. And we won't spend any more time on that. So here we go. Let's measure GDP. Okay, and this is really the nuts and bolts of what we want to talk about here. So what we're going to use is called the expenditure approach to measuring GDP. And I do need you to understand and recognize that. Now, what's going to be useful for us when we learn this equation, which is C plus IG, or sometimes just I is fine there, plus G plus X with a subscript of N equals GDP. That might sound complicated at first, but what we're going to realize very quickly is that it's not complicated at all. So what I'd like you to do right now, and this will be a good practice, is go ahead and draw on your paper somewhere a very small and maybe pretty crude and rough version of the circular flow model of the economy. Go ahead and do that right now, and I'll do one too. Alright, so I've finished mine, and as you can see, I left a lot off here, but what I did include was firms, the government, households, and the rest of the world, and I showed how stuff flows through the resource of the products market. Well, why did I have you just do that just now? Well, it's a good review. You should understand the circular flow model, but really, understanding this model is going to help you understand this equation, which I call SIG-X, and I'm going to say SIG-X so much that you'll think it's an actual word, but I'm pretty sure I made it up. Well, you're going to understand SIG-X very easily by understanding this. Because what this model is actually able to illustrate to us is that the entire economy is roughly split in half, right? Like this. You could split the economy like that. All of the money that flows from firms to households we call income, right? And all of the money that flows from households to firms is basically called spending, right? And every dollar you spend is a dollar someone else earned. That's kind of the insight from this model. Well, what we're using is the expenditure approach to measuring GDP. And what you would realize if you stare at this long enough is that since this spending equals this income, if you measure just one half of this or the other, you've measured the entire size of the economy. And that's what GDP is. And so what we're going to do here is measure everybody's spending. That's why it's called the expenditure approach. And by the way, the word expenditure is a fancy word for spending. There's really no difference. So we're going to measure everyone's spending. Well, who is everybody? Well, the first folks out there who can spend are households. And that is what the C is in our equation. Consumption spending. Okay, so when households spend money, it's consumption spending. Okay, who else is out there that can spend money on final goods and services made within the U.S. in a year? Well, firms can. But when businesses spend money on stuff, we call that investment, and that's what the I is. Okay, so the I with a subscript of G, when you see it, that stands for gross private investment. Private being not the government. Okay, so investment. Who else can spend money out there? Well, yeah, you guessed it, the government can spend money. And that's what the G is. The G is government spending. And then finally, the rest of the world can spend money on U.S. goods and services that are completed in a year. And that is what the XN is, and that is net exports. And we actually touched on that a little while ago. Okay? So really, this equation, C plus I plus G plus net XN equals GDP, SIG-X, as I call it, is really just adding up the spending of all the people who are out there who can spend. So it's not very intimidating. Now, what I want to do is, over the next 4 slides, I'm going to kind of touch on each of these individually because they kind of have their finer points. So let's start with consumption spending. It's consumer spending or household spending on durable goods like cars and appliances. And a durable good is really something that is expected to be only purchased once in a year. Is an easy way to think about that. Then you have your non-durable goods like food and clothing and things that you buy often throughout the year, and also services. So let's not forget about services. That's all very straightforward, okay? When people spend money on final goods and services, well, that's consumption spending. This is important because it's the largest component of U.S. GDP. In fact, it's about 70% of U.S. GDP. So of all of the stuff that is sold in a year, that's made by the United States, about 70% of it is sold to households. And so how much money households are spending is very important to policymakers. So whenever you hear news about how, maybe the holiday shopping season isn't as strong as we thought it would be, and you think, well, why is that in the news? Well, it's in the news because that's an important signal to the health of the economy, because that consumption spending is an enormous part of U.S. GDP. The next one, gross private investment, is, like I said before, businesses spending, but it's business spending in order to increase future output and productivity, right? So when a business spends money to be able to make more money or to increase production, that's investment. Importantly, to an economist, an investment is something that leads to more production. An investment is not what you might think of when you're thinking of financial investments, which are just like stocks and bonds and, buying companies and stuff like that. Those are financial things, but they don't lead directly to more production. An investment is like, I built a factory. I purchased a robot that puts bumpers on cars. That's investment. So, businesses spending on capital. Straightforward there. But also new construction is an example of gross private investment, and importantly, even new homes. Well, who lives in houses? Well, households, right? And so you might want to put, buying a new home into the category of consumption spending. But homes are treated as investments, and for good reason. You take out a loan to get a home. It typically appreciates in value, and it's one of the most valuable things that most households will ever purchase. So, homes, importantly, one of these kind of nuances that you have to remember, new homes count as gross private investment, not household spending. And of course, if a business purchases real estate like a factory or just land where they want to, in the future, build a business, well, that's gross private investment. And then finally, there's this idea of a change in unsold inventory. And this is a little bit complicated, but I'll take a moment to explain it, and it shouldn't be too bad. Let's think about what we're doing here. We're measuring everyone's spending and saying that's how much was actually produced. Well, the obvious question might become, well, what if something was produced and no one bought it and no one spent any money on it, right? Well, then you would have not captured that production. Well, this is the answer to that. This is the fix. Because all we have to do is say, okay, if Toyota built 5 trucks and they only sold 3 of them, yes, that year they did build 5. That was production. So whatever they could have sold that truck for, we'll count that as GDP. And that is an unsold inventory. And that's about all that you need to know there. We have government spending now, and this is the most straightforward one. All levels of government spending on final goods and services and infrastructure count towards GDP. So maybe the only thing that might come as a surprise or food for thought here is that it's not just the federal government. It's your municipalities or towns, it's counties, it's state governments. They're all spending money, and all of that money counts towards GDP. We're going to actually break down a lot of government spending in the future because government spending is part of fiscal policy, which we'll talk about down the road. Importantly, government transfer payments do not count towards GDP. And think back to our circular flow model when we learned what transfer payments were. Those things like social safety net stuff, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Veterans Affairs benefits, things like that. Okay, so that's money that's being spent by the government, but is actually not counted towards GDP as government spending. And then there's net exports, and that is exports minus imports. So how much stuff we sold to the rest of the world minus how much stuff we purchased from the rest of the world. And you may have heard of something called a trade deficit, and that is the fact, I'll let you read this as I talk about the trade deficit. That is the fact that the United States, since World War II, has always imported, meaning purchased more stuff from the rest of the world than we've exported or sold to the rest of the world. So what net exports ends up being is a negative number. Okay, so what ultimately you usually do here when you add up GDP is you add consumption spending to investment to government spending, and then you subtract the trade deficit. But what you're really doing is you're adding net exports. Net exports happens to be a negative number. Okay. Now, the title of this slide is the income approach. And this is just a different way that you could measure GDP. Because remember, if we go back to our circular flow model, we're only measuring this part. Well, if we measured this part, we'd get the same number, right? Problem is, this is a much more complicated thing to do, and so we don't do it. I do need you to understand that this is something that exists, though. So if you're asked about the income approach, this is that. But what we're doing is the expenditure approach, and that is SIG-X. Now what we have here is rent plus wages plus interest plus profits, and if you break this down, those are actually the factors of production. Rent, right? It's income earned from selling the factors of production. I'll put it that way. Rent is the money you earn from the land you own. Wages are the money you earn from the labor that you sell. Interest, a little harder to get here mentally, but interest is the money you earn from the capital you might own, or from letting people borrow so that they can invest in capital. And then profits are the money you earn if you become an entrepreneur. Now, like I said, complicated. We don't do this, but I need you to know what it is and that it exists, okay? Last two things you need to know about GDP, and then I'm going to let you go. Nominal versus real GDP. I promise you we'd talk about this. Nominal is not adjusted for inflation, but real GDP is adjusted for inflation. And so what we have to do is deflate the GDP. Okay, and we'll have something called the GDP deflator, but we'll talk about that actually later. But this is that distinction between saying that, okay, how much could I sell everything that was produced this year in today's prices? That would be nominal GDP. But if I said, well, what could I sell everything that we produced this year in last year's prices, or some other base year price, that's real GDP. And it's a better, more useful measure of whether the economy actually grew. Did we actually produce more, or did prices just go up? Okay, so actual production is captured in real GDP, and we're going to find that's our more useful measurement. And then there's GDP per capita, and per capita simply means per person, and so you're taking GDP, whether real or nominal, and you're dividing it by the population. This is meant to give us a better measure of economic well-being, because a country like India has a pretty large GDP, but also they have an enormous population. If you divide the GDP by the population, you end up with a pretty small GDP per capita, indicating less well-being. Take, on contrast, Saudi Arabia, maybe a smaller GDP, but a very small population. If you divide the GDP by the population, you get an extremely high GDP per capita. That's all for today. Happy studying.